Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a closer look at each of the 9 targets in the original Assassin's Creed, who they were, what made them so corrupt, and the impacts they had on the people of the Holy Land. These weren't just random villains, each of them had their own backstory, their own role in the Holy Land during the Crusades, and their own reasons for being part of the Templar cause. Some were merchants, others were religious leaders, military commanders, or scholars, and all of them were connected with the same goal in mind. So whether you're replaying the game or just curious about the lore behind these characters, we are going to break down the lives and deaths of the 9 targets that were put to rest by the legendary assassin Altair. Before I start, I do quickly want to say that I am aiming to reach 1000 subscribers by the end of the year, and your support would help tremendously. Also, when I'm explaining how the targets died, I'll be using the description of how it happened from the Secret Crusade novel, and the gameplay may not match up with the description, so please do keep that in mind. Temir, who was once a mere footnote in the bustling markets of the Middle East, transformed himself from an insignificant supplier for the Saracen forces into the infamous master of Damascus's most powerful trading hub, the Souk al-Salah. What began as a modest venture grew into a sprawling black market empire, overshadowing all commerce in the city's poor district. At its height, Temir's marketplace trafficked everything imaginable, common goods like bread and oils alongside exotic luxuries, contraband and deadly weaponry. He built a reputation on his uncanny ability to acquire anything for anyone, so long as they were willing to pay his steep price. One popular account tells the tale that Temir's origins were humble. He supposedly began as a simple fruit and vegetable trader, running caravans between Damascus and Jerusalem. But as the region's appetite for produce dwindled before the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Temir found himself facing ruin. In a desperate bid to avoid losses, he took his surplus north, and in a twist of fate, encountered Salah ad-Din's starving army. His timely delivery of food allegedly renewed their strength, contributing to their decisive victory over the Crusaders. For this, Salah ad-Din, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, rewarded him with favour, gold, and opportunity. Whether that tale was truth or mere propaganda, what cannot be questioned is that by 1191, Temir had fully turned to the underground trade. He excelled in the illicit manufacture and distribution of weapons and armour, and his fortune grew rapidly. Though he publicly served the Saracens, Temir swore secret allegiance to the Templar order. His loyalty to the Templars made him an invaluable asset, as they relied on him as the central supplier for their covert operations across the Holy Land. With access to a vast network of blacksmiths, smugglers and wealthy financiers, Temir came to control one of the largest and most dangerous criminal enterprises in the region. The Templars placed regular orders with him, but in the summer of 1191 they demanded an unprecedented shipment, enough arms to equip a force of 1,000 soldiers in a matter of weeks. The enormity of this order strained even Temir's resources and forced him to lean heavily on the Merchant Guild and the financial support of Abu Nukud, the so-called Merchant King of Damascus and a fellow Templar conspirator. Infuriated when the weapons failed to meet the deadline despite round-the-clock labour, Temir summoned the entire Merchant Guild to the Souk al-Salah. He sought to intimidate and coerce them into working harder and contributing more resources. By then, however, many guild members were exhausted and resentful. Temir ruled with ruthless authority. He often demanded unpaid work and was notorious for publicly executing anyone who dared to refuse or oppose him. Yet fear kept most in line, especially since the city guards turned a blind eye to his brutality, either brought off or too afraid to interfere. Temir's confrontation with the Merchant Guild, intended as a harsh punishment for their failure to meet his massive weapon shipment, would, unbeknownst to him, become the final act of his life. Though Temir believed himself untouchable, he and several other high-ranking Templar leaders had already been condemned to death by none other than Al-Muwalim, the enigmatic Grand Master of the Assassins. To carry out this secret purge, Al-Muwalim chose his finest student, Altair. After a thorough investigation into Temir's operations and patterns, Altair made his move. He infiltrated the bustling central courtyard of the Souk al-Salah just moments before Temir's arrival, choosing this public forum as the stage for assassination. Temir soon entered from one of the shaded arcades, already embroiled in a heated argument with a weary merchant, accusing the man of laziness and incompetence for failing to deliver the impossible order. Temir showed no patience for excuses. The merchant tried to explain that his craftsmen were working non-stop and that the delivery route was extremely dangerous, but Temir dismissed his concerns as weak-minded drivel. When the merchant dared to suggest that Temir's demands were unreasonable, the arms dealer's temper exploded. He stepped forward, spat in the man's face and drew his dagger in a fit of rage. The merchant immediately pleaded, realising the mortal danger, but Temir was far beyond reason. He slashed the man violently across the abdomen, sneering with sadistic pleasure. Ignoring the merchant's cries for mercy, Temir continued his frenzied assault, striking him repeatedly. Only after the man had been sliced open multiple times and left bleeding near the fountain did Temir pause, merely to shout another insult before driving his blade into the man's back several more times. The final blow sent the merchant collapsing into the fountain, crimson blood clouding the waters. To send a message of terror, Temir ordered his guards to leave the corpse where it lay, a grotesque warning to all. Those gathered around the courtyard quickly scattered or pretended not to have seen anything, fearful of becoming the next example. Temir then made his way through the market, inspecting each vendor's goods, angrily rebuking every store owner he encountered. No product pleased him, every batch of wares was deemed subpar or unacceptable. Arrogance and cruelty consumed his attention so completely that he failed to notice Altair quietly closing in behind him. Altair had intentionally waited for the moment when Temir would be distracted by his own tyranny. As Temir threatened another terrified merchant, Altair struck. In his final breaths, Temir denied the accusation of being nothing more than a profiteering butcher. He insisted he served a grander righteous cause, that he was a necessary instrument in a far greater design, orchestrated by his secret brotherhood, hinting that larger forces were at play beyond Altair's understanding. With those cryptic words, Temir was at last put to rest. Garnier de Naples served as the 10th Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, a monastic military order founded after the First Crusade. Originally, the Hospitallers were devoted to caring for sick and injured pilgrims near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Over time, though, they evolved into a powerful military force, escorting and protecting travellers across the Holy Land, eventually rivaling the Knights Templar in both influence and strength. Garnier joined the order in 1177, working as a commander of the hospital in Jerusalem. About a decade later, his ruthless efficiency and medical knowledge earned him a promotion within the order's ranks. But Garnier's reputation in France was far from noble. He was exiled for his brutal, unethical treatment of his patients. To him, the sick were less than humans and more so test subjects, bodies he could use to experiment with his new cures, regardless of the pain or fatal outcomes. Knowledge in Garnier's eyes was worth more than any price, even if that price was someone else's life. He lived in Tyre for a while, but his habit of conducting cruel experimental surgeries got him expelled from there too. Thanks to his wealthy family's heavy financial support of King Richard the Lionheart's crusade, Garnier found protection in Acre, where he was allowed to continue his work unchecked. In Acre, he surrounded himself with loyal assistants who were either well bribed or just as twisted as he was. He practically turned the hospital into a prison. Only select visitors were allowed in, and patients were physically crippled or restrained to keep them from leaving. Over time, Garnier convinced himself that these poor people were lost souls in need of guidance, and that he alone had the right to reshape them as he saw fit. Eventually, Garnier became a member of the Templar Order. Like the rest of the Templar leadership, he was taught their philosophies and learned of their grand vision for humanity's future. He also learnt about the Apple of Eden, a powerful artifact at the centre of the Templars' plan for control. When the assassins stole the apple, Garnier wrote to the Templar Grand Master, Regent Désilets, warning that without the artifact, his experiments would be greatly hindered, and the assassins could become a more serious threat to everything the Templars were trying to achieve. After the Crusaders captured Acre, Garnier was placed in charge of the city's poor district as part of his reward. He quickly turned the local hospitaller into his own personal laboratory, where he resumed his horrifying experiments on the sick and destitute. Many of his patients were not volunteers at all. They were secretly transported from Jerusalem through Talal's human trafficking network. Stories of screams, mutilations, and people going in but never coming out spread quickly. The citizens of Acre grew so afraid that they stayed far away from the hospital. Eventually, Altair infiltrated the hospitaller fortress to eliminate Garnier. Just as he slipped in, a frantic patient attempted to flee the premises, but was immediately caught and dragged back by guards. Garnier emerged, speaking gently at first, pretending to soothe the terrified patient with soft, reassuring words. But when the patient lashed out, accusing Garnier of being a monster, Garnier's facade dropped. In front of onlookers, he coldly ordered the guards to break the man's legs, explaining that this would ensure he could never run again. The crowd was horrified, but Garnier dismissed their shock as weakness and forced them out so he could continue his work. Once Garnier returned deeper into the hospital's chambers, Altair silently followed. Navigating the dark hallways, he found Garnier alone with another patient and struck quickly, killing him with a single blow from the hidden blade. In his dying moments, Garnier insisted that he was not a villain. He claimed that he was healing people who had been abandoned by the world, the poorest, the sickest, the lost souls no one else cared about. He argued that many of them had benefited from his treatments and were grateful for his intervention. Even as Altair refuted him and accused him of cruelty and madness, Garnier maintained that his methods were necessary to cure both body and mind. "This isn't a matter of belief," he said with conviction, "it's a matter of truth." Before Altair could question him any further, Garnier passed away, still believing himself to be a saviour. Talal had once served proudly in the ranks of the Saracen army, but after leaving military life behind, he returned to Jerusalem and drifted into a far darker profession. There he formed a gang of ruthless outlaws who were fiercely loyal to him, operating from a rundown warehouse hidden in the city's poor quarter. It didn't take long before Talal's name spread in hushed whispers across Jerusalem. He and his men were snatching men, women, and even children off the streets, regardless of wealth or status, and selling them into slavery. Many of his victims were secretly transported north to Acre, where they ended up in the hands of Garnier de Neplows for use in his twisted experiments. Though the city guard knew full well about Talal's crimes, they were happy to look the other way as long as his bribes kept flowing. This unofficial agreement made him feel untouchable. Talal was more than just a slaver. He was an exceptional athlete and deadly fighter, renowned for both his archery and swordsmanship. He was confident to the point of arrogance, never shying away from boasting about his skills. If anyone questioned his actions, Talal defended them without shame. He claimed that the people he captured, beggars, thieves, prostitutes, and drifters, were better off under his control. In his eyes, slavery gave them structure and purpose, turning their miserable lives into something useful, through discipline and hard labour. It was this twisted sense of justification that fueled his operation, allowing him to see himself not as a villain, but as a man providing order to a chaotic world. Altair tracked Talal's movements through the wealthier districts of Jerusalem, and eventually discovered that the slaver had taken refuge in his warehouse. The moment the assassin stepped inside, Talal's voice rang out, taunting him with a mixture of arrogance and fear. Quick to seize the advantage, Talal positioned his men around the assassin, smugly declaring that he led him into his trap. He gave a single command to his loyal guards: kill the intruder. Without hesitation, the men lunged forward, intent on ending Altair's life. But the assassin was far more skilled and agile than they anticipated. One by one, he dispatched the guards, moving with lethal precision until the room fell silent. Talal's confidence quickly turned to panic as he realised the danger he now faced. Seeing no other choice, Talal fled the warehouse through a hidden trapdoor in the ceiling. Altair pursued him immediately, weaving through narrow alleys and darting across rooftops in a high-speed chase that tested both men's agility and endurance. Throughout the pursuit, Talal frequently glanced over his shoulder, attempting to persuade Altair to spare him. He shouted excuses and half-hearted apologies, trying to buy his life with words. In his distraction, however, he failed to notice a civilian woman carrying several clay jugs. The collision sent both of them tumbling to the cobblestones, jugs shattering and water spilling across the street. Altair seized the moment without hesitation, closing the distance in a few swift steps and plunging his hidden blade into his target. As he lay dying, Talal tried to justify his actions. He insisted that those he had captured were amongst the poorest and most desperate in Jerusalem, people he claimed had sought to help rather than exploit. He argued that he had not profited from them, but had given them structure, purpose, and a chance of survival. He admitted, however, that he no longer believed in an afterlife, and that the people he had saved had long since abandoned their faith, just as he had. With those final words, Talal's life faded away. Abul Nuqoud, the wealthy merchant king of Damascus, had at some point in his life become a member of the Templar order. Abul could never bring himself to support the ongoing wars carried out in the name of God, who had once deemed him an abomination. Instead, he indulged in a life of extravagance and excess, hosting grand, lavish parties that drew nobles from across the region. His palace overflowed with priceless works of art, the finest silks and velvets adorned his person, and he dined on the richest and rarest foods available. Every detail of his life reflected his taste of luxury, power, and ostentation. Yet beneath the gilded exterior lay a cruel and ruthless man. Abul harboured deep resentment toward the poor, who he blamed for the world's misfortunes. His arrogance and bitterness often drove him to commit shocking acts of violence, murdering dozens of innocent citizens, or as punishment for perceived slights. He took particular pleasure in tormenting those of lower status, using deception, manipulation, and outright cruelty to assert his dominance. Selfish to the core, he measured the world only by how it benefited him. His wealth, power, and knowledge of the Templar secrets made him both feared and hated, and his reputation as a decadent, ruthless merchant spread far beyond the walls of Damascus. For him, life was not about morality or justice, it was about indulgence, control, and the satisfaction of his own ego. When Altair tracked Abul, he discovered that the merchant king had thrown an opulent party at his palace, inviting the wealthiest and most influential nobles of Damascus. The event was funded with gold and resources stolen directly from the city's treasury, a portion of which had been also funneled into the Templars' larger plans for their new world order. The palace glimmered with extravagance, from gilded chandeliers to lavish tapestries, reflecting Abul's insatiable appetite for luxury and dominance. As the guests settled and the wine flowed freely, Abul appeared on his balcony to propose a toast, praising the generosity of those assembled, but mid-speech his tone shifted. He openly scorned his guests, berating them for their cruelty, hypocrisy, and unwavering support of Salah ad-Din's campaigns. The nobles soon realised too late that the wine had been poisoned, part of Abul's scheme to punish those who had mocked or persecuted him. At his command, his guards were ordered to prevent anyone from escaping, turning the grand celebration into chaos and terror. Amid the panic, Altair moved with precision, navigating the frightened and confused crowd to reach his target. Using the chaos to his advantage, he pursued Abul through the palace corridors, past servants and guards alike, until he finally cornered the merchant king and struck him down with his hidden blade. In his final moments, Abul addressed the assassin, insisting that his actions were not driven by petty vengeance. Instead, he claimed he sought to create a new, better world, one that was unshackled from the dictates of a god who had branded him an abomination. He questioned Altair's own convictions, hinting that the assassin's willingness to kill on Al-Muwalim's orders might blind him to the true worthiness of a cause, warning that the line between justice and fanaticism could be dangerously thin. With that, Abdul-Nakud was no more. At some point in his life, William aligned himself with the Templar Order, becoming an active participant in Grand Master Robert Désilets' schemes to assert control over the Holy Land, which was being torn apart by the ongoing conflicts between the Crusaders and Saracens. As part of the Templars' larger strategy, William became involved in the pursuit of the legendary Apple of Eden, as this artifact is said to grant control over minds and influence entire armies. To further this plan, he was entrusted with soldiers to train, but these were no ordinary men. Many were slaves kidnapped by Talal, indoctrinated and manipulated by Garnier de Naples, and armed with weapons supplied by Tamir. Meanwhile, the Templar cause was financed by Abdul-Nakud, who funneled stolen wealth from Damascus's richest merchants and nobles into their operations. After the fall of Acre, William was appointed to Regent of the city by King Richard the Lionheart. On the surface, this appointment seemed to signal the king's trust in him, but the assassin Rafiq Jabal soon deduced that it was, in fact, a strategic move to keep William under close watch, effectively a hostage, to ensure his son Conrad would not rebel. Conrad had contested the kingship of Jerusalem against Guy of Lusignan, a vassal of Richard, which fueled deep mistrust between William and the king. William's own respect for his son was minimal, yet his interactions with Richard were often strained, characterised by mutual suspicion and lingering tension. In moments of frustration, William frequently took out his anger on the soldiers under his command, punishing them for minor failures or perceived disloyalty. One of the darkest episodes of William's tenure came about on the 20th of August 1191. Believing it would intimidate the Saracen forces, he ordered the execution of 3,000 Saracen prisoners, all of whom King Richard had intended to exchange for Christians captured by Salah ad-Din. Far from achieving the desired effect, the act provoked outrage and condemnation. Even King Richard publicly denounced William, accurately predicting that such brutality would only harden the enemy's resolve and further inflame the ongoing conflict. Altair arrived in Acre to begin his investigation into William's activities, quickly uncovering evidence that the regent was hoarding food and wealth, leaving the city's citizens to struggle. At the same time, Altair observed the widening rift between King Richard I and his regent, a tension that threatened to destabilise the fragile leadership in the city. Unbeknownst to Altair, William had become aware that he was being watched, and realising he was the assassin's next target, set a cunning trap. He believed that the assassin would walk right into his ambush. However, William's plan was foiled by a team of Levantine assassins sent by Al-Muwalim, who intervened to ensure Altair's mission could proceed. These assassins struck decisively, eliminating William's loyal bodyguard, Isambard, and clearing Templar and Crusader patrols throughout Acre, leaving William with no choice but to retreat to the supposed safety of the Acre citadel. Once Altair had gathered sufficient intelligence, he made his way to the front of the citadel, where he observed a heated exchange between King Richard and William over the recent execution of the Saracen prisoners. William, visibly agitated, argued that the king had judged him too harshly and accused Richard of failing to place sufficient trust in him. King Richard reminded William that the position of regent was a rare honour that carried great responsibility and should not be dismissed lightly. William in turn raged that the king had misunderstood his intentions entirely, but Richard, wary of the argument and unwilling to waste time on disputes in the middle of a war, ended the discussion abruptly. Humiliated and enraged by the public reprimand, William retreated to the inner chambers of the citadel, his anger spilling over onto his men. In a shadowed corner of the keep, he berated his soldiers, accusing them of dereliction of duty and demanding stricter discipline. He declared that from that day forward, their training would be doubled in intensity, regardless of exhaustion or lack of nourishment. To make his point terrifyingly clear, he singled out two men who had failed in their patrol duties and had their throats cut before the others that were present, this being a brutal warning meant to instill fear and obedience in the ranks. Altair, having tracked William into the heart of the fortress, picked off the archers stationed along the outer walls without alerting the rest of the garrison. Once William concluded his latest tirade at his soldiers and the men dispersed, he began sifting through his documents. It was in that moment that Altair struck, dropping down from the battlements and delivering a lethal strike with his hidden blade. As William lay mortally wounded on the floor, Altair confronted him, stating that he knew of William's supposed plan to assassinate King Richard and hand Acre over to his son, Conrad. William, with biting sarcasm, denied the accusation, surprising the assassin with his composure. He went on to claim that Acre had never truly belonged to Richard or Conrad, but to its citizens. According to William, every action he had taken, from hoarding resources to maintaining strict control, was intended to uphold order and prepare the city for times of crisis, not to exploit or oppress its people. Altair, unconvinced, argued that William's methods were cruel and excessive. Using his final moments, William shot back, accusing Altair of enforcing judgment while condemning cities to suffering, rather than working to save them. His words lingered with the assassin, a haunting mix of defiance and bitterness, before William's life finally slipped away. Majd ad-Deen's story begins humbly. He was once nothing more than a scribe, a man whose life revolved around ink, parchment, and the quiet work of recording the deeds of others. Yet at some point, ambition, resentment, or perhaps opportunity drew him into the ranks of the Templar Order. When Salah ad-Deen was absent from Jerusalem, Majd ad-Deen seized the chance to rise far beyond the station of a humble clerk. Through his connection with the Order, he was able to consolidate power and take control of Jerusalem by becoming the city's regent. In his mind, he was bringing order and unity, but in practice, his reign quickly became one of fear. Majd ad-Deen was a zealot for control. He believed that the world should be seen and lived exactly as he dictated, and those who defied his strict worldview were branded as enemies. Trials were swift, punishments merciless, and public executions became common spectacles meant to terrify the population into obedience. What made him cruel was the way his laws shifted constantly, a web of confusing edicts that kept people uncertain of what might condemn them next. Where Salah ad-Deen had fostered tolerance and coexistence among the city's many faiths and peoples, Majd ad-Deen methodically unravelled it. He ruled with paranoia and intimidation, convincing himself that he was protecting Jerusalem from chaos, even as he suffocated it beneath a blanket of fear. Majd ad-Deen's so-called trials were little more than theatre, mock proceedings staged to justify his brutality. Anyone who caught his suspicion, whether through rumour, defiance, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could find themselves dragged before him. The charges were always twisted or exaggerated, and the outcomes were a foregone conclusion. What Majd called justice, the people recognised for what it was. These spectacles weren't meant to uncover truth, but to break the will of Jerusalem's citizens, ensuring that dissent was stamped out before it could ever take root. In these grim displays, Majd presented himself as the ultimate authority. He carried himself with a sharp, commanding voice, one that left little room for argument. When Altair arrived in the poor district of Jerusalem to begin his investigation, whispers of another execution reached him. This time, it wasn't just a nameless victim. Majd had targeted the son of a local leader, hoping to make an example that would frighten anyone, even thinking of opposing his rule. However, a small band of brave citizens had begun plotting to intervene, desperate to save the young man's life and to strike back at Majd ad-Deen's cruelty. When the day of the execution arrived, the square filled with a tense crowd. One by one, Majd brought forth his accused, a supposed prostitute, a thief, a gambler, and finally a heretic. But the last prisoner wasn't who Majd thought, it was an assassin. Malik himself had tasked Altair with ensuring that Majd never left the square alive, and that this heretic's presence was the chance he needed. As Majd thundered on, passing judgment with his usual venom, the brave citizens who had planned to resist finally made their move, but their courage was short-lived. The Regent's guards and archers struck them down without mercy, turning what might have been a spark of rebellion into yet another example of the Templars' iron grip on the city. He turned to the so-called heretic, unaware that this prisoner was in fact an assassin. But before he could pass judgment, Altair seized his moment. Slipping through the panicked crowd, he mounted the stage and plunged his hidden blade into the Regent's body. In the chaos that followed, Malik's assassins rushed in to free their captured brother, whilst Altair dragged Majd aside to hear his last words. As he lay bleeding, Majd ad-Deen's defiance did not falter. He admitted that while he had worked with the Templars to tighten their hold on Jerusalem, his true ambition was far simpler. He craved power, and the fear it inspired in others. He sneered that Altair would have done the same, if only he was honest with himself. The assassin, cold and resolute, rejected the comparison. With no more words to exchange, Altair delivered a second, final strike with his hidden blade, ending the tyrant's life. By 1191, Sibrand had risen to prominence as the first Grand Master of the newly established Knights Teutonic. This appointment granted him immense influence and authority. Yet rather than leading with confidence, Sibrand became consumed with fear of losing his position. Obsessed with the idea that enemies lurked everywhere, he resolved to cling to power by any means necessary, no matter how ruthless or irrational. His paranoia soon began to poison both his rule and his mind. Convinced that conspiracies surrounded him on all sides, he took increasingly drastic measures to secure his safety. Patrols were doubled throughout Acre, and soldiers were ordered to watch not only the streets but one another as well. He threatened to strip knights from the battlefield itself, preferring their swords to be used in guarding his person rather than fighting the Saracens. Sibrand saw betrayal in every whisper and treachery in every shadow. His obsession with control soon turned toward Acre's docks, a place he regarded as the city's lifeline. He seized command of the harbour, placing it under strict military supervision, and began commandeering ships in large numbers. His intention was clear. When the Templars enacted their plan to seize dominion over the Holy Land, his fleet would form a blockade to sever the region from outside aid. Kings, queens, and would-be crusaders would be helpless to intervene once his vessels sealed the coast. It was during this period that Sibrand formally pledged himself to the Templar cause. Though his paranoia often made him unpredictable, the Order valued his ambition and control of Acre's vital trade routes. In return, he was entrusted with one of their greatest secrets, knowledge of the fabled Apple of Eden. Guarding this truth only deepened his descent into madness, as the thought of such power slipping from his grasp became unbearable. He endlessly patrolled the district, scrutinising every man under his command, barking at them for even the smallest mistakes. When he caught two guards away from their posts, he berated them with venomous words, threatening to double their shifts and accusing them of negligence. Fear of betrayal burned so fiercely in him that he treated loyalty as treason waiting to happen. Unbeknownst to the paranoid Grand Master, Altair was already in the district, watching quietly from the shadows and listening carefully as he prepared to strike. Before long, Sibrand shifted his attention to the docks themselves, and there his suspicions boiled over into cruelty. Spotting a humble scholar dressed in white robes, a garment that reminded him too much of the assassins who had already slain so many of his Templar brothers, he seized the opportunity to make an example. With manic intensity, he shouted accusations at the man, mocking him and humiliating him in front of the crowd. The terrified scholar protested his innocence. Convinced he was staring at an assassin in disguise, he beat and eventually slew the poor man, using his death as a warning. Turning to the horrified civilians, he bellowed that anyone who dared to aid the assassins would share the same fate. After this cruel display, Sibrand donned his distinctive horned helmet and made his way toward his personal ship, his paranoia only deepening as he prepared to retreat into what he believed was safety. Altair tailed him carefully, but despite his skill, one of Sibrand's sentries caught sight of him. The assassin acted swiftly, silencing the man with a throwing knife, but the splash of the corpse hitting the water echoed across the docks. Sibrand's nerves snapped instantly. In a frenzy, the Grand Master grabbed his bow and began loosing arrows in every direction, screaming defiantly at the shadows. His shots struck down birds overhead and splintered the wood around him as he cried out that he would destroy the assassins himself if no one else dared. His fear had consumed him fully, twisting into madness as he fired blindly into the air and water. Taking advantage of the chaos, Altair moved like a phantom, scaling the sides of Sibrand's vessel and boarding it without being seen. When the moment was right, he struck, ending the paranoid ruler's life with his hidden blade. As Sibrand lay dying, his arrogance faltered, replaced by a hollow admission. He told Altair of his role within the Templars' grand design, of the fleet meant to seal the Holy Land from outside interference. Yet he also confessed something more personal, his belief that death held nothing beyond it, no paradise nor punishment, only void. And even in his final words, he sought to prove that nothing awaited either of them in the world beyond. With that, his voice failed, and Sibrand breathed his last aboard the ship he had hoped would shield him. Known as the leader of a circle of scholars called the Illuminated, Jubair al-Hakim once held a respected place within the court of Salah ad-Din, guiding intellectual life in Damascus and commanding great influence among the city's learned men. But away from the admiration of the public, Jubair pledged himself to the Templar Order, secretly working to advance their vision of a liberated Holy Land. Over time, this ideology warped Jubair's once genuine pursuit of knowledge into a fanatical hatred of it. Convinced that books and teachings only spread corruption, discord, and war, he turned his fellow scholars into zealots who scoured the city for scrolls, tomes, and manuscripts, piling them into great pyres and reducing them to ash. Jubair taught them that the written word was the true source of violence, that the Crusaders themselves were born of religious texts that drove men to slaughter in the name of God. To him, erasing knowledge was not destruction, but purification. In truth, however, Jubair's campaign was part of the Templars' larger design. By burning every work of philosophy, science, and religion, the Order sought to empty the world of ideas until only their doctrine remained. In this vision, knowledge would not vanish, it would simply be rewritten, and controlled, wielded as a tool of obedience rather than a source of enlightenment. Joubert himself displayed open contempt for revered thinkers of the past, such as Plato and Socrates, all of whom he dismissed as dangerous corrupters of men's minds. He declared that learning was a disease, trapping people into their fixed beliefs and blinding them to what he believed was their true destiny under the Templars. His intolerance left little room for compassion, and he showed no hesitation in silencing those who disagreed with him, whether by fire or by the sword. While most of his followers embraced his message and carried out his orders, not all shared his unshakable zeal. Some quietly questioned whether knowledge itself could truly be the root of evil, and whispers of doubt spread among the ranks. Even within his own household, resistance took root. Joubert's wife, appalled by his crusade, secretly gathered and hid away books that he marked for destruction, hoping to save some remnants of wisdom from the flames. In 1191, Altair arrived in Damascus, with his next target in sight. He learned that Joubert and his closest followers would gather at the Madrasa al-Khalasa to oversee the destruction. Infiltrating the Madrasa, Altair kept to the shadows as he entered the courtyard. There he found Joubert surrounded by fellow scholars, tossing armfuls of manuscripts into a raging fire. The assassin watched with quiet fury, forcing himself to remain patient despite the revulsion he felt. For the assassins, knowledge was a cornerstone of freedom and understanding. The deliberate destruction of it was a crime against truth itself. As the flames grew higher, one of Joubert's own followers finally spoke out, protesting that the texts that they were burning were not curses, but gifts meant to inspire and enlighten. Rather than listen, Joubert turned on him with scorn, asking if he truly loved his books. When the man admitted that he did, Joubert, consumed by rage, shoved him directly into the inferno. The unfortunate scholar was engulfed in flames, his screams echoing through the courtyard, as Joubert coldly asked the rest of his followers if any others wished to join him. None dared to answer, and he ordered them to spread throughout Damascus and continue the bonfires. What followed was a deadly challenge for Altair. Dozens of scholars dressed like Joubert filled the streets, each one a potential decoy meant to confuse pursuers. Altair hunted patiently, observing mannerisms and listening for slips of authority, until finally he identified the true Joubert. Striking swiftly from the shadows, Altair plunged his hidden blade into the Templar. Mortally wounded, Joubert used his final moments to justify his actions. He argued that the books made men blind and ignorant, that they clung to words on a page rather than thinking for themselves. By burning them, he claimed, he was freeing the people of Damascus from the chains they didn't even know they wore. Altair, however, saw only cruelty and hypocrisy in Joubert's philosophy. For him, knowledge was not a prison but a path to enlightenment, and destroying it was an act of tyranny. He then left Joubert to perish. Robert de Sablis was born around 1150 as the heir to the lordship of Sablis in Anjou. He inherited the title a decade later in 1160, though by that time, Sablis had already been absorbed into the growing Angevin Empire. Despite this, Robert maintained his influence and carved a reputation as a capable nobleman and ambitious leader. By 1173, his ambition pulled him into a greater conflict when he sided with Henry the Young King, heir to the English throne and the Duchy of Normandy, during the rebellion against Henry II. Though this gamble initially risked his standing, Robert managed to restore his reputation after the young Henry's death in 1183. This ability to adapt and survive shifting loyalties would later define his rise to power among the Templars. By July of 1191, Robert's role within the Templar Order had grown considerably. Leading a detachment of soldiers, he descended into Solomon's temple beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, seeking a legendary piece of Eden hidden within its ancient chambers. As his men began climbing towards the artifact, they were ambushed by three assassins, Altair and the brothers Malik and Kadar. Altair attempted to kill Robert directly, but Robert proved more skilled than anticipated. He parried the assassin's strike and held him aside with such force that a small rock slide sealed the chamber's entrance, leaving Malik and Kadar trapped inside with the Templar soldiers. A brutal fight broke out. Kadar was slain in the melee, and Malik suffered a grievous wound to his arm. Yet in the chaos, Malik managed to seize the artifact from Robert's men and escape with it. Though the assassins had scored a small victory, Robert refused to let the loss stand. He immediately set his sights on Masyaf, the mountain stronghold of the Brotherhood, determined to reclaim the piece of Eden and crush their resistance in one decisive blow. Gathering his forces, he pursued Malik out of Jerusalem, leading his men north towards Assassin territory. Upon reaching Masyaf, Robert found unexpected support. A villager named Masoon, along with a local basket weaver, sympathetic to the Templar cause, betrayed the Brotherhood by opening the gates. Robert and his troops stormed into the town, cutting down civilians and assassins alike, in a ruthless assault meant to break the morale of the order. Despite their determination, the assassins of Masyaf struggled to hold off the sheer force of Robert's invading Templars. One by one, they were pushed back, forced to retreat into the safety of their mountain fortress. Robert himself soon arrived at the gates on horseback and demanded that the assassins return the artifact. He claimed that it belonged to him by right, declaring that resistance would only lead to needless deaths. Calmly but firmly, the mentor denied Robert's claim, stating that the artifact was not his to wield. Robert scoffed at this, accusing Al-Muwalim of arrogance and warning that the Templars had the patience and strength to simply wait the assassins out, but the mentor had other plans. At his signal, 3 assassins leapt from the fortress walls in a dramatic show of defiance, distracting the Templar army long enough for Altair to spring a hidden trap. A barrage of massive logs came crashing down the mountainside, crushing dozens of Robert's men and scattering the rest in chaos. Altair learned that Robert was expected to attend the funeral of Majd ad-Din. Altair prepared for the confrontation, but Robert was cunning. Knowing he was the assassin's next target, he staged a deception. He ordered his trusted lieutenant, Maria Thorpe, to disguise herself as him and attend the funeral in his place. When Altair struck, he discovered too late that he'd been tricked. Still, he defeated Maria in combat, and instead of ending her life, he chose to spare her. Grateful and shaken, Maria revealed Robert's true intentions. He had left Jerusalem entirely and joined King Richard's army, marching to the battlefield at Arsuf. Altair set off to face Robert one last time, determined to bring an end to the Templar Grand Master's schemes. During the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, Robert positioned himself at the side of King Richard the Lionheart, presenting himself as a loyal ally and trusted advisor. With the chaos of war unfolding around them, Robert sought to strengthen his influence over Richard by warning him of a supposed greater threat, the assassins. He argued that these killers had been the true cause of countless deaths on both sides, manipulating events from the shadows to prolong the conflict. He even urged Richard to consider the unthinkable, forming an alliance with Salah ad-Din against the assassins for the sake of a more stable Holy Land. Meanwhile, Altair cut his way through the battlefield, facing both Crusaders and Saracens who stood in his path. Determined to reach Robert, he fought through the chaos until he finally infiltrated the Crusader camp, where Richard and Robert awaited. Standing before the king, Altair tried to expose the truth. He explained that the men he had slain were not innocent soldiers, but Templars in disguise, plotting rebellion and seeking to enslave the land under their rule. He insisted that Robert's loyalty to Richard was a lie, and that the Grand Master intended to betray him when the time was right. Robert, however, countered with his own words. He painted the assassins as deceivers by nature, masters of twisting truth into falsehood. He told Richard that Altair's claims were nothing more than desperate lies. Faced with 2 opposing stories, Richard was left uncertain. Rather than choosing one side, the Lionheart declared that God himself would reveal the truth. He decreed that Altair must face Robert in combat, and that the outcome of the duel would determine whose cause was righteous. The duel between Assassin and Templar was fierce. Robert was not only a seasoned warrior, but also a man fueled by pride and conviction, and for a time he matched Altair blow for blow. But eventually the assassin's discipline and agility proved greater than Robert's strength. With a final strike of his hidden blade, Altair brought the Grand Master to his knees. In his dying moments, Robert revealed a final shocking truth. The true mastermind of the Templar scheme was not himself, but Al-Muwalim, the very mentor of the assassins. He confessed that Al-Muwalim had long been working with the Templars. With that revelation, Robert drew his last breath, leaving Altair to grapple with the possibility that everything he thought he knew had been a carefully orchestrated deception. And that's the story of all 9 targets from the very first Assassin's Creed. Each one had their own twisted vision of control, and each one played a role in shaping Altair's journey and the bigger picture of the Templar-Assassin conflict. It's crazy looking back now, because while they seemed like isolated villains at the time, they were all pieces of a much larger game that Al-Muwalim was secretly pulling together. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the lore and the lives of the targets, let me know in the comments which one you found most interesting, or maybe which assassination mission stuck with you the most. And if you want me to keep diving into Assassin's Creed history and lore, definitely hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and I hope to see you in the next video.